All right, welcome to the Week 11 Forum. This week we're turning back to one of the vignettes Robertson introduced in Chapter 4 on race. A little over 4 years ago, an unarmed young African American male by the name of Michael Brown was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri by a police officer. This killing capped a series of police-related encounters, shootings, and at least in one instance, strangling of African American males. Um, and the shooting sparked protests and rioting that compelled the governor of Missouri, Democrat Jay Nixon, to call the St. Louis police in to investigate the shooting. And the FBI opened a civil rights investigation as well, which revealed a number of problems with the way the city of Ferguson dealt with its African American population. So, what does this incident illuminate about federalism and intergovernmental relations? By now, we should all be aware of the bright side of federalism, that it creates space for very different populations of people to exist within a broader, more tolerant regime. But it also brings with it a dark side, which is that federalism creates space for intolerant majorities to discriminate against stigmatized minorities. Um, this article by Richard Rothstein really lays bare the extent to which every layer of the American governmental system was complicit in policies that led to the systematic discrimination in residential housing that placed African Americans and other minorities on a pathway to permanent political and economic disadvantages. In other words, Ferguson is a much broader story replayed throughout the United States. In his introduction, Rothstein suggests that the media's account of how Ferguson became Ferguson is so incomplete as to be erroneous. What does Rothstein believe that the mainstream media missed in their account of African Americans moving out to the suburbs like Ferguson and the resulting white flight? Um, and the whole phenomenon of white flight. What is it? What is really informing it? As I read Rothstein's account of how federal, state, and local actors work to systematically maintain a system of segregation in residential housing, the concept again of path dependence kept springing up in my mind. How did laws and policies enacted in the early 20th century perpetuate systems of segregation after the formal, de jure basis for discrimination was removed? One of the interesting facts that I learned from reading this article is that from the Civil War to the early 20th century, St. Louis had a relatively small but relatively integrated working class black population. There were no like predominantly white, predominantly black. There were many neighborhoods that were exclusively white, but there were also a lot of neighborhoods that had some African Americans living in them. So according to Rothstein, something happened that created a demonstration effect. And this is something that Robinson discusses in Chapter 4 as well, which was Woodrow Wilson's overt segregation of the federal government. How did that decision reverberate around the country? One of the first things that happened to segregate residential areas was the imposition of racial zoning statutes, which basically forbade whites from selling their homes to blacks or other minorities. Now, the Supreme Court struck those kinds of ordinances down. Uh, what was the court's justification for holding that racial zoning ordinance were unconstitutional? How did segregation-minded municipal officials and real estate developers get around that law or get around that interpretation? Rothstein argues that the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which was a New Deal era thing, in many instances colluded with the insurance industry in the furtherance of housing segregation. How did that relationship work? Rothstein also notes that the federal government's investment in public housing was pretty straightforwardly racist. How were blacks and other minorities shunted off into public housing while subsidies were made available to allow working class whites to move into suburban residential neighborhoods, single family homes? In the mid 20th century, you really have a movement that we broadly describe as suburbanization or white flight, where whites left large urban areas, and basically that was made possible by again the building of single residence homes and the automobile. Um, how at some point do suburbs like Ferguson make a fairly rapid transition from being predominantly white to predominantly black? That's another kind of movement within this broader, set of social upheavals. Another instrument of segregation that Rothstein mentions are these ideas of restrictive covenants. That's where neighborhood association agreements would bound the original and subsequent owner from selling their home to an African American. Um, were these kinds of restrictive covenants, strictly speaking, legal? One thing that becomes clear over the course of Rothstein's narrative is that the judicial system consistently concluded that racist policies were racist and were unconstitutional. But those rulings were consistently ignored or outright or worked around in some other way in order to achieve the majority population's preference, which was segregation. And adding insult to injury, he's basically saying that churches, universities, and hospitals participated in forming and enforcing those policies. Um, the other side of the coin of subsidizing working class whites so that they could live in nice single family homes in nice neighborhoods was what happened to segregated predominantly black neighborhoods. The denial of service, poor lighting, poor police enforcement. Rothstein notes that municipal governments routinely employed eminent domain to prevent blacks from moving into or otherwise infiltrating white neighborhoods. Um, I'll mention two other famous examples of how this situation worked and impacted residential housing. Blockbusting and racial steering. Blockbusting involved the evaluation of white neighborhoods, or the evacuation of white neighborhoods by inducing a panic that the value of their homes would rapidly decline due to the encroachments of black homeowners. Racial steering, on the other hand, basically prohibited real estate agents from placing black families in white neighborhoods. This was essentially a universal norm within the real estate profession, and violating that prohibition could result in an agent losing their license. Think about that for a moment. Real estate is one of the most regulated industries in the American economy, and it was virtually a universal norm that a real estate agent must violate federal laws banning racial discrimination in order to remain in good odor with their profession. Obviously, there's a lot to discuss in this article, and if you're anything like me, reading this really pissed you off. Racism, in my view, remains a serious flaw of American character, and we have a long way to go before we can honestly say that racism isn't a factor in American politics or American life. And that's certainly something that we can discuss over the course of this week. Again, as always, if you have any questions, the forum is an excellent place to address that. Let's have a good discussion.